A quiet conspiracy to construct an independent second court has just been shattered inside the British monarchy, leaving King Charles III completely paralyzed as Prince William and Catherine draw an absolute line across the next reign. The king walked into his private study at Sandringham, expecting nothing more than a routine morning. On his desk lay the standard winter allocation ledgers, the kind of dry estate paperwork that usually demands a quick signature and nothing else. Then the heavy oak doors swung open. Prince William and Catherine stepped into the room, carrying a red leather dispatch box, its wax seal bearing the insignia of the Royal Audit. Without a word of small talk, Catherine picked up a silver paper knife and sliced straight through the crimson stamp, laying the first sheet directly before the monarch. Under British constitutional law, charitable patronage is meant to serve as an impartial public duty, strictly bound to the reigning crown without private political machinery. The audit told a radically different story. Spread across the polished mahogany were bank transfers redirecting sovereign charity capital into a private cultural trust operated by Queen Camilla's personal aides. Beneath those receipts sat signed retaining agreements, long-term media contracts, senior press officers, and strategic advisors quietly hired to preserve an autonomous communications headquarters long after the current king is gone. The king's fingers froze over the fountain pen. His gaze drifted up, searching for an explanation, but William met his eyes with an unyielding stare. "This is not a budget review," the prince stated coldly. "It is an audit of systematic overreach." The silence in the room became unbearable. Was this bold maneuver a necessary institutional purge to safeguard the throne, or a ruthless personal score settled under the disguise of constitutional law? Leave a comment below with 1 if this was pure institutional protection, or 2 if you believe it was personal revenge. The silence inside the private study at Sandringham grew heavier, broken only by the crisp rustle of parchment as Catherine laid out the core of the investigation. Every document spread across the mahogany surface was organized with surgical precision. This was no longer a vague suspicion spoken in whispers along palace corridors. It was a forensic dissection of a calculated financial architecture assembled piece by piece over months of quiet inquiry. The king sat motionless behind the heavy desk, his reading glasses slipping slightly as his eyes scanned the ledger sheets. Page by page, the audit exposed an intricate mechanism designed to siphon sovereign legitimacy into private autonomy. Substantial endowments, originally intended for national heritage conservancies and public arts councils under royal patronage, had been quietly redirected through layered trusts. The funds did not disappear into personal bank accounts. Their destination was far more dangerous to the institutional stability of the crown. They were being pooled into an autonomous operational budget, legally insulated from the central royal household, and placed under the direct discretion of Queen Camilla's private office. In British constitutional practice, royal patronage is an instrument of state. It exists as an extension of the reigning monarch's soft power, designed to elevate charitable causes without pursuing independent leverage. When a royal title is used to anchor private capital beyond parliamentary oversight, the boundary between public duty and personal influence dissolves entirely. The sovereign grant and the established royal trusts are structured precisely to ensure that no member of the royal family operates as an unaccountable corporation within the state. Catherine pointed directly to a series of binding retainer clauses embedded within private staffing contracts. These agreements were not standard palace appointments that automatically lapsed upon a monarch's passing. They were ironclad, multi-year retainers securing senior press secretaries, foreign policy liaisons, and digital media strategists. The language within the contracts was unmistakable. This entire apparatus was structured to remain active, fully funded, and legally answerable to Camilla, regardless of who sat upon the throne. The king looked down at the highlighted paragraphs, his breathing shallow. His fingers twitched against the armrest of his leather chair, but he offered no immediate defense. Across from him, Catherine's voice remained even, deliberate, and devoid of theatrical rage. She traced her finger along a sequence of financial flowcharts that mapped the projected public reach of this secondary office over the next decade. The reality was laid bare. This covertly funded machinery would allow a surviving consort to command a permanent public platform. It would maintain independent press channels, issue separate statements, organize autonomous patronages, and shape public narratives parallel to the sovereign. In practical terms, it would create an unelected second court operating beside the legitimate monarch, capable of dividing national attention and diluting royal authority at the very moment a new reign required absolute cohesion. William leaned forward, his hands resting flat against the edge of the desk. The prince's gaze was sharp, stripping away any pretense of administrative confusion or innocent oversight. Transforming sovereign patronages into instruments of permanent personal relevance was not merely improper, it was an abuse of official standing. A royal consort holds ceremonial visibility entirely through marriage to the reigning king, not through an independent constitutional mandate. Attempting to anchor that visibility into a perpetual institution after the reign ends represents a direct challenge to the crown itself. The prince outlined the operational consequences with clinical detachment. A fractured communications machinery would force the government, the Commonwealth, and the international press to navigate two competing centers of royal gravity. Every public statement issued from Clarence House would be weighed against the declarations of Buckingham Palace. Every charitable campaign led by a former queen would risk overshadowing the strategic priorities of the new king and queen. Such a division would undermine the sovereign's exclusive role as the sole focal point of national unity, creating confusion over who truly speaks for the institution. Under the unwritten conventions of the British Constitution, the Crown's authority relies entirely upon the singular nature of the sovereign. Dual courts have historically triggered factionalism, palace intrigue, and institutional paralysis. The modern monarchy, already under intense public and financial scrutiny, cannot survive the burden of competing royal households operating with separate agendas and independent war chests. Catherine closed the financial ledger with a dull thud that echoed softly against the wood-paneled walls. Her words landed with finality. The civil machinery, the communications infrastructure, and the sovereign revenue of the monarchy exist to serve only one entity, the reigning monarch. There is no constitutional precedent, no legal right, and no inherited entitlement that allows a royal widow to carry an active court into the dawn of a new reign. King Charles III snapped the red leather binder shut, the sharp clap echoing off the tall windows overlooking the Sandringham grounds. His hands shook with suppressed frustration as he leaned forward, pressing both palms firmly against the edge of the mahogany table. The king's voice broke the suffocating quiet, strained, and heavy with resentment. He looked directly past Catherine, fixing his gaze upon his eldest son. "Do not dress this up as constitutional duty, William," the king said, his tone biting and raw. "This is not about ledgers or trusts. You are using the machinery of an audit to settle a score that has haunted this family for 30 years. You are punishing Camilla to balance an old ledger for your mother." The air in the room thinned instantly. The mention of Diana, Princess of Wales, hung over the polished desk like an unshielded flame, threatening to drag the confrontation into an endless cycle of family bitterness and emotional grievance. For decades, every disagreement regarding Camilla's status had been trapped in that exact narrative, an inevitable clash between an aggrieved son and a protective husband, where institutional logic was constantly dismissed as lingering personal malice. William did not flinch, nor did he offer an angry denial. He held his father's gaze with absolute composure, refusing to give the king the emotional reaction that might derail the procedural reality of the audit. But the prince did not need to speak. The decisive move had already been calculated, and it did not come from him. Catherine stepped forward. With measured calm, she reached into the inner compartment of the leather dispatch box and drew out a single legal document, crisp and newly drafted on official palace stationery. The paper bore the official stamp of the Crown's senior legal counsel, accompanied by Catherine's own distinct signature at the bottom of the final page. She placed the document squarely in front of the king, smoothing the paper flat against the wood. "This is not about the past, Your Majesty," Catherine said, her voice steady, low, and devoid of any tremor. "And to prove it, we are not asking Queen Camilla to submit to any rule that I am not binding upon myself this very morning. In constitutional terminology, a royal covenant of renunciation is a voluntary legal instrument through which a senior member of the royal family permanently surrenders potential prerogatives before they can be claimed. It creates an irreversible precedent, legally binding upon the signatory and overriding any future claims to discretionary authority." The king looked down at the document, his brow furrowing as his eyes traced the formal legal clauses. What he was reading was nothing short of a total, unilateral surrender of future power. Within the covenant, Catherine formally declared that in the event of William's death and the subsequent accession of Prince George to the throne, she voluntarily renounced all rights to maintain an independent operational office. The document explicitly mandated the freezing and transfer of every single patronage, trust fund, and private foundation under her name directly back to the central administration of the new monarch. The surrender went further than financial assets. Catherine had legally bound herself to dismantle any private communications team, refusing to retain personal press secretaries, digital brand managers, or independent policy advisors upon becoming a queen mother or former consort. The legal text made it absolute. She would never use her status or public popularity to operate a shadow court beside her son, nor would she permit a single pound of sovereign funding to sustain a personal media apparatus outside the direct control of the reigning sovereign. The silence returned to the study, but its nature had fundamentally shifted. The accusation of personal revenge had been completely dismantled. By placing her own neck under the exact same guillotine she was preparing for Camilla, Catherine had stripped the king of his only defense. This was no longer a targeted attack against an unwanted stepmother, it was a universal standard of institutional discipline. The Princess of Wales had deliberately eliminated the very privileges she might one day desire for herself, ensuring that no future consort, regardless of bloodline, popularity, or public sympathy, could ever dilute the authority of the reigning monarch. King Charles stared at Catherine's signature, his fingers resting motionless against the paper. The arguments he had prepared, the emotional defenses of Camilla's years of service, the indignation of a husband defending his wife, all of it collapsed under the weight of this single, self-imposed restriction. He searched the face of his daughter-in-law for hesitation or regret, but found only the cold, unyielding resolve of a future queen who understood that the survival of the crown required absolute, equal sacrifice. There was no longer any moral ground left for the king to stand upon. To defend Camilla's private trust now would mean demanding special exemptions that the future Queen of the United Kingdom had already freely renounced for the good of the realm. The debate was over, extinguished not by anger, but by a sacrifice so complete that no counter-argument could survive it. The heavy silence inside the Sandringham study lingered, thick and unyielding, as King Charles III stared at Catherine's signed covenant. The king's hand trembled slightly against the mahogany surface, his mind racing to find any remaining constitutional leverage, any procedural loophole that could grant Camilla an exception. But before he could formulate a single counter-proposal, William delivered the decisive institutional blow. The Prince of Wales did not raise his voice. He simply reached back into the red dispatch box and produced a secondary file, bound in dark navy leather and bearing the official seal of the High Commission of Royal Audits. "Before we brought these ledgers to Sandringham, Your Majesty," William said, his words measured and cold, every invoice, every diverted endowment, and every retaining agreement was submitted for formal review. This file has already passed through the hands of the Princess Royal. The mention of Princess Anne caused the king's breath to catch. His shoulders tightened instantly. In the intricate hierarchy of the royal family, Anne was not merely a sister, she was the unimpeachable pillar of duty, the ultimate arbiter of royal protocol, and the formal overseer of the Crown Estate's internal integrity. Her reputation for relentless administrative rigor and absolute disdain for personal extravagance made her the most feared and respected figure in royal governance. Under the unwritten statutory rules governing royal administrative trusts, any systemic audit endorsed by the senior trustee of royal integrity carries binding executive weight, requiring no parliamentary intervention to enforce internal compliance. An endorsement from that office effectively elevates an internal inquiry into a formal institutional decree. Princess Anne had not merely examined the documents, she had spent 3 consecutive days cross-referencing the trust declarations against the historic statutes of the civil list and the modern regulations of the sovereign grant. Upon verifying the clandestine flow of capital from public arts councils into Camilla's private holding accounts, Anne had affixed her signature to the audit without a second thought. William opened the navy folder, turning it toward the king so the bold, sharp strokes of his aunt's unmistakable signature were clearly visible beneath the official crest. "Allow me to read the Princess Royal's official assessment," William continued, his voice echoing evenly off the high ceilings. "The modern monarchy operates under an unnegotiable social contract with the public. Sovereign revenue cannot, under any circumstances, be funneled into sustaining shadow courts from bygone eras. A streamlined institution requires every pound of funding and every thread of public representation to converge under the sole authority of the reigning monarch. Any mechanism designed to preserve private leverage for a former consort is an intolerable defect in governance." Every word hit the room like a hammer striking stone. Anne's written verdict stripped away any lingering ambiguity. She had categorized the private media contracts and autonomous funding structures not as an understandable spousal provision, but as a dangerous defect that threatened the structural survival of the monarchy. The king sank deeper into his chair, the color draining from his face. Anne's intervention removed his final line of defense. Had this challenge come solely from William and Catherine, Charles could have attempted to appeal to paternal authority or dismissed the audit as generational impatience. He could have delayed the decision through endless family mediation. But with Anne standing firmly behind the Prince and Princess of Wales, the king was completely isolated. In royal statecraft, when the heir to the throne, the future queen, and the most senior working royal align on a matter of institutional discipline, the reigning sovereign cannot stand alone without risking a catastrophic constitutional rift within the House of Windsor. Anne held the unwavering trust of the palace old guard and the senior civil service. Her backing transformed William's audit into an inescapable verdict. The king looked from the signature to his son's impassive face. The realization settled over him with crushing clarity. The old order he had spent decades trying to protect was gone. There were no private alliances left to call upon, no sympathetic courtiers who could draft a quiet compromise. The machinery of the crown had closed ranks around the future, leaving the present monarch powerless to shield his past choices. The verdict had been delivered, ratified by the highest authority of royal integrity, and the king had no choice but to bow to the inevitable. The heavy mahogany door creaked open, breaking the stifling silence of the Sandringham study. Queen Camilla stepped inside, having been summoned by an urgent message that carried none of the usual palace pleasantries. She paused near the threshold, her hand lingering on the brass handle as her eyes swept across the room. The atmosphere was charged with an icy, clinical tension that instantly set her on edge. Her gaze fell first upon the red leather dispatch box, resting squarely in the center of the table, flanked by the open folders bearing royal seals. Then she looked at the king. Charles sat slumped in his high-backed chair, his face drawn, staring blankly at the scattered ledgers without offering a word of greeting or a single reassuring glance. That look of total defeat told her everything she needed to know. The defensive wall they had quietly constructed for years had just collapsed. Camilla walked forward, her footsteps muted against the wool rug. She took her seat beside the king, attempting to maintain an aura of royal composure, but the slight tightening around her jaw betrayed her growing unease. William did not wait for formal pleasantries. With a face carved from granite, the Prince of Wales stood upright, holding a single sheet of embossed parchment. He began reading the operative decree with chilling precision, treating the matter not as a family dispute, but as a binding administrative order. Under the verified findings of the Royal Financial Audit, and with the formal assent of the senior trustee of royal integrity, William recited, his voice steady and detached, all autonomous holding structures, private media trusts, and redirected endowment reserves under the jurisdiction of Your Majesty's private office are hereby placed under immediate freeze. Every non-standard staffing agreement, retainer, and long-term advisory contract negotiated without Central Treasury authorization is rendered void. Furthermore, the Private Communications Bureau operating from Clarence House shall be officially dissolved on the day the current reign concludes. The words landed like physical blows. The complex financial apparatus Camilla had spent years quietly assembling, the carefully chosen advisors, the digital outreach specialists, the loyal press officers designed to safeguard her public image and relevance long after Charles was gone, was being dismantled in a matter of seconds. A flush of anger and humiliation rose to Camilla's cheeks. She leaned forward, her voice trembling slightly with sharp bitterness as she looked directly at the prince. "Is this the gratitude the crown offers?" she demanded, the bitterness in her tone cutting through the quiet. "After decades of bearing the public scorn, after endless years of loyal service and quiet work to rehabilitate this institution, am I simply to be erased from national memory? Are you telling me that the moment Charles closes his eyes, I am to be locked away in the countryside like an outcast, a nameless widow stripped of every dignity?" The raw emotional outburst threatened to drag the room into an undignified confrontation, but Catherine stepped in before the tension could explode. The Princess of Wales maintained absolute poise, her hands resting naturally in her lap, her expression remaining one of respectful, unflinching neutrality. "Your family status and personal dignity will remain entirely intact, Your Majesty," Catherine said, each syllable measured and calm. "You will be afforded the full personal security, residential comfort, and private respect appropriate for a former queen consort. But public life is not a personal entitlement. From the beginning of the next reign, your public appearances and charitable engagements will take place exclusively upon the formal invitation of the reigning monarch. The Crown cannot permit parallel courts to dictate the national agenda." Camilla opened her mouth to mount another fierce objection, ready to call upon tradition, spousal rights, and the king's authority to overrule this unilateral judgment. But before she could speak, William reached forward and turned the next page of the file toward her. There, stamped in blue ink and bearing Catherine's own bold signature, lay the irrevocable covenant of renunciation. "You are not being singled out, Your Majesty," William said, his eyes locking onto hers with unwavering authority. This is not an act of hostility against an individual. It is the establishment of an unalterable constitutional standard. The Princess of Wales has already signed away every single privilege you are currently defending. When my reign concludes and George ascends the throne, Catherine will operate under the exact same boundaries. No private media teams. No independent political offices. No shadow court. Camilla looked down at the signature, her arguments dying in her throat. Under the unwritten conventions of the British Crown, a precedent of self-abnegation, set by the future sovereign and his consort, creates an absolute standard of governance. To demand special privileges after the future queen had willingly signed away her own would reduce Camilla's defense to a desperate plea for personal luxury at the expense of the institution. The resistance drained out of the room. Camilla stared at the crisp black ink of Catherine's signature, realizing with absolute finality that every exit had been blocked. There were no appeals to be made, no private negotiations to pursue. The cold, mechanical logic of the next generation had closed around them both. She sat back slowly into the leather cushions, her hands trembling as she folded them in her lap, forced into a silent, bitter submission before the unyielding architecture of the new reign. The heavy oak doors clicked shut as Catherine and Camilla stepped out into the corridor, leaving an oppressive, suffocating stillness behind. The grand study at Sandringham was suddenly stripped of all procedural decorum. The legal files, the wax seals, and the formal titles faded into the background, leaving only two men facing each other across the mahogany table, an aging father whose physical frailty was becoming impossible to conceal, and an heir who had already begun wielding the cold levers of sovereign power. King Charles slumped deeper into his chair, the monarch's posture giving way to the exhaustion of an old man whose lifelong battles had caught up with him. He removed his reading glasses with a trembling hand, pressing his fingertips against the bridge of his nose. When he looked up, the anger from earlier had dissolved into raw, aching vulnerability. She gave up her entire private life for this family. "William," Charles said, his voice cracking slightly, stripped of all royal grandeur. For decades, she absorbed the hatred of the press and the public without a word of complaint. All I ever wanted was to know she would be protected when I am gone. Are you truly prepared to leave her entirely at the mercy of your goodwill? To make her twilight years an exercise in quiet humiliation, waiting for an invitation just to step into the public eye? The emotional appeal hung in the room, heavy with decades of family trauma and the desperate plea of a husband fighting for his wife's dignity. William did not look away. His hands remained clasped behind his back, his jaw set in an unyielding line. In constitutional history, the most dangerous moments for a hereditary monarchy have never been foreign wars or economic crises. They have always been the moments when personal sentiment eroded the singular authority of the crown. "The greatest cruelty to this institution," William replied, his tone low, measured, and devoid of malice, "is allowing personal emotion to compromise sovereign discipline. If we bend the rules to comfort our family today, the public will dismantle the monarchy tomorrow. The throne cannot survive as an emotional compromise." Charles stared into his eldest son's eyes, searching for even a flicker of hesitation, a single trace of the boy who once wept behind a carriage. He found nothing. Standing before him was a sovereign in waiting who had mastered the ultimate requirement of kingship, the willingness to be entirely ruthless in defense of the realm. William had purged the sentimental weaknesses that had plagued Charles's own generation, forging an iron political will that would never negotiate with the past. A bitter smile touched the king's lips. Without another word, Charles took his fountain pen and quietly signed the transfer document. In that silent surrender, the remnants of the old court faded away, clearing the path for the absolute centralization of the next reign. By the following morning, the Sandringham Financial Protocol was formally ratified, bearing every required signature across its final parchment. The covert apparatus constructed around Queen Camilla's private office was permanently dismantled. Sovereign funds were redirected back to the centralized treasury, and the future management of Clarence House was legally assigned to return to general royal administration the moment the current reign ends. Behind closed doors, confidential directives reached senior staff across royal residences. Transition teams began planning the phased closure of peripheral communication branches, consolidating all future public relations, digital strategy, and media releases under the singular authority of Buckingham Palace. In British constitutional governance, sovereign centralization ensures that the Crown operates without rival centers of gravity, eliminating parallel factions that could fracture institutional stability. William and Catherine departed the Sandringham estate in total silence. Their departure signaled an unyielding reality for the monarchy. The next era will be governed by a single monarch, supported by a singular, disciplined court. In the brutal arena of royal power, the institution never tolerates the presence of a second shadow beside the sovereign. Yet, as the gates closed behind them, a profound question remained. By dismantling Camilla's safety net and voluntarily binding herself to the very same restrictions, did Catherine secure a resilient, disciplined future for the monarchy, or did she quietly construct the walls of her own eventual isolation? Share your thoughts and perspectives in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next in-depth analysis of the power dynamics behind palace doors.